I'm Major General Morgan, and I clawed my way from a studio over a pizza shop to a two-star command. For years, I covered bills, bridged crises, and kept showing up for family that didn't show up for me. But when my father tried to belittle me at my brother's wedding, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been undervalued by someone you poured your life into? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before we dive in, drop where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, tap like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there from the time I could tie my own shoes, scattered like breadcrumbs through a childhood that looked normal from the outside, but felt like walking on glass. Dad's approval came with conditions I never fully understood. When I brought home straight A's in third grade, he glanced at my report card and said, "Your brother got A+ in math." When I scored the winning goal in soccer, he mentioned how Sarah's team made it to regionals. Nothing I did was ever quite enough, never the right shade of impressive. The favoritism wasn't dramatic, no Cinderella story here. It was subtler, woven into the fabric of daily life. My siblings got new bikes. I got my brother's hand-me-down. They got driving lessons at 16. I had to figure it out myself. When college brochures arrived, Dad sat down with my sister to discuss her options. When mine came, he left them in a stack on the kitchen counter. "You'll figure something out," he'd say when I brought up my future. "You always do." I told myself it meant he had faith in my independence. Now I know it meant he'd already written me off. The mocking started small. When I joined debate team, he called it arguing for sport. When I volunteered at the animal shelter, he said I was playing with puppies instead of getting a real job. Every interest, every achievement, every small step toward becoming my own person got filtered through his lens of dismissal. My mother would shoot him warning looks across the dinner table, but she never said anything directly. The unspoken rule in our house was that Dad's opinion mattered most, and challenging it created ripples none of us wanted to navigate. I remember the exact moment I realized his respect was transactional. I was 15, working my first real job bagging groceries after school. I came home exhausted and proud, waving my first paycheck like a flag of independence. Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "About time you started pulling your weight around here," he said. "Your sister's been babysitting since she was 13. The paycheck suddenly felt smaller in my hands. I'd thought earning my own money would prove something to him, that I was responsible, mature, worthy of his notice. Instead, it became another measuring stick I'd failed to meet soon enough. His temper was like weather in our house. You learned to read the signs and take cover when the pressure dropped. A certain set to his shoulders meant someone was about to get dressed down for leaving a dish in the sink. The way he folded his newspaper meant the rest of dinner would be eaten in silence. I developed an early warning system, watching for the tells that meant I should make myself scarce. But sometimes you get caught in the storm anyway, and his words could strip you bare faster than hail. "You're too sensitive," he'd say when I'd flinch at his criticism. "The world's going to eat you alive if you don't toughen up." But toughening up in his eyes meant becoming smaller, quieter, less trouble. It meant not asking for things, not expecting much, not taking up space he'd rather give to someone else. The control was everywhere once I learned to see it. He decided what music played in the car, what shows we watched, where we went on family vacations. Our opinions were welcome as long as they aligned with his. Disagree, and you'd get a lecture about respect and knowing your place. I watched my siblings navigate this landscape with varying degrees of success. My brother learned to mirror Dad's interests, sports, cars, politics delivered with the same edge. My sister perfected the art of agreeable silence, nodding along and keeping her real thoughts to herself. I tried both approaches, but neither fit right. When I attempted to engage with his interests, he'd quiz me like I was faking it. When I stayed quiet, he'd accuse me of sulking or being ungrateful. "What's wrong with you?" became his favorite question for me. It suggested there was something fundamentally broken that needed fixing, something that made me different from the rest of the family in ways that disappointed him. The worst part wasn't the criticism, it was the growing certainty that nothing I did would ever change his mind about me. I could see it in the way he looked at me, like I was a problem he couldn't solve, a project that hadn't turned out the way he'd hoped. Other parents came to my school events, my games, my award ceremonies. Dad showed up when it was convenient, left early when it wasn't, and spent most of the time checking his phone or talking to other parents about their kids' achievements. I don't know where she gets it from. I heard him say once when my art teacher was praising a painting I'd done, as if my creativity was some random genetic accident that had nothing to do with him. By senior year, the foundation of our relationship had cracked beyond repair. Every conversation was a minefield. Every request for support, whether financial, emotional, or just basic acknowledgement, was met with sighs and rolled eyes. I started making plans that didn't include him. College applications filled out in secret, scholarship essays written without his input, dreams crafted in the spaces he couldn't reach. I was 18 and learning that sometimes protecting yourself means building walls around the things that matter most. The distance grew wider as graduation approached. While my classmates talked about family celebrations and gap year plans bankrolled by proud parents, I calculated how many hours I'd need to work to afford my own future. "You're on your own now," he said when I got my diploma, as if that hadn't been true for years already. I should have known then that our breaking point was coming. The tension in our house had become unbearable, crackling like electricity before a storm. Every interaction carried the weight of everything left unsaid, all the ways we'd failed each other accumulating like debt. But I was still naive enough to think that family meant something. That blood created bonds strong enough to survive disappointment, strong enough to bend without breaking. I was wrong. The fight that ended everything started over something small. It always does. I'd applied for a summer program without asking his permission first, something that would have seemed natural for any other 18-year-old, but felt like rebellion in our house. He found the acceptance letter on my desk and confronted me at dinner, in front of everyone. The program was in another state, a leadership retreat for high school graduates interested in public service. It was fully funded, an honor to be selected, and exactly the kind of opportunity that should have made any parent proud. Instead, Dad saw it as defiance. "Who do you think you are, making decisions like this without discussing it with your family?" His voice carried that particular edge that meant the storm was about to hit. I tried to explain the application deadline, the competitive selection process, the fact that I hadn't expected to get in. But every word I spoke seemed to make him angrier. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his face reddening. "You think you're better than the rest of us. You think you can just do whatever you want without consequences." The unfairness of it hit me like a slap. Here was an opportunity that could change my life, and he was treating it like a personal insult. My siblings sat frozen in their chairs, watching the familiar dance of his anger and my stubborn refusal to back down. "I'm trying to build a future," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Isn't that what you always told me to do? Don't get smart with me." He stood up from the table, towering over me. "You want to make adult decisions? Then you can live with adult consequences." The words that came next would echo in my head for years. Cold, final, delivered with the precision of someone who'd been thinking them for a long time. "If you're so grown up, if you know better than your family, then you can figure it out on your own. Pack your things. You've got until morning." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face went pale, my siblings stared at their plates, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. This wasn't just anger, this was abandonment, served up like it was my choice. I wanted to apologize, to take it back, to find some way to fix what I'd broken. But the look in his eyes told me it was already too late. This wasn't about the program or the letter or anything I'd done that day. This was about all the ways I'd failed to be the daughter he wanted, all the disappointment that had been building for 18 years. So I packed. Clothes, books, the few things that felt like mine in a house that suddenly felt like a hotel I couldn't afford. My hands shook as I folded t-shirts and gathered the pieces of a life I'd thought was permanent. No one came to help. No one knocked on my door to say it would be okay. The family that had raised me watched from a distance as I loaded everything I owned into garbage bags and a single suitcase. In the morning, I stood at the front door with my pathetic pile of belongings, hoping someone would stop me, would say this had all been a terrible mistake. Dad read his newspaper at the kitchen table like it was any other Tuesday. My mother washed dishes with unusual intensity. My siblings had already left for school. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything I'd ever known. I was 18 years old, homeless, and utterly alone. But as I stood on that front porch, breathing the morning air that suddenly tasted different, I made myself a promise. I would not let this define me. I would not let his rejection become my truth. I had no idea then that it would take 18 years to prove it. Before everything fell apart, there were good years. I know that sounds strange given what came after, but memory doesn't follow the neat lines of a story. Even in families that break, there are moments of grace that complicate the narrative. I was 7 when Dad taught me to ride a bike. I can still feel his hands steadying the seat as I wobbled down our driveway, his voice calling, "I've got you, kiddo," until the moment he let go and I was flying solo. The pride in his eyes when I turned around, still pedaling, still upright, that was real. He came to my elementary school plays, cheering from the audience when I forgot my lines and improvised something that made everyone laugh. He helped me with math homework at the kitchen table, patient with my struggles with long division in a way that felt like love. Those early years were built on a foundation of small devotions. Saturday morning pancakes shaped like animals, teaching me to throw a curveball in the backyard. The way he'd let me stay up past bedtime when there was a good movie on TV, both of us sharing a bowl of popcorn while Mom pretended not to notice. I worshipped him then, the way children do before they learn that parents are just people making it up as they go along. He seemed larger than life, the final word on everything that mattered. When he praised me, the world felt bright and possible. When he was disappointed, everything dimmed. Looking back, I can see how hard I worked for those moments of approval. I joined Little League because he loved baseball, spent hours perfecting my swing in hopes of earning his nod of recognition from the stands. I took piano lessons, not because music called to me, but because he mentioned once that he wished he'd learned to play. Every choice I made was filtered through a simple question: would this make Dad proud? The trouble started when I began developing interests that didn't align with his vision of who I should be. He wanted athletes. I gravitated toward art. He valued practical skills. I lost myself in books. He respected traditional paths. I was drawn to anything that seemed different, challenging, unexplored. "She's getting ideas above her station," I heard him tell my mother once when I announced I wanted to be a writer. The phrase stuck with me for years, the suggestion that I was reaching for something beyond my proper place in the world. But even as the criticism increased, I kept trying. I joined track team to show him I was tough. I took business classes in high school to prove I was practical. I dated the boys he approved of and wore the clothes that met with his nods of satisfaction. The exhaustion of constantly performing, of never being allowed to just exist as myself, built slowly over the years. But I told myself this was normal, that all teenagers struggled with their parents' expectations. I thought if I could just find the right combination of achievements and choices, I'd crack the code of his approval. My siblings and I developed an unspoken understanding about managing Dad's moods. We'd warn each other with subtle signals when he was having a bad day, create diversions when one of us was in trouble, cover for each other's small rebellions. "Don't tell Dad" became our family motto for everything from broken dishes to bad grades to boyfriend drama. We learned to handle our own problems rather than risk his disappointment or anger. My brother had the advantage of being naturally good at things Dad valued. Sports came easily to him, and he had Dad's same dry sense of humor, the same way of commanding attention in a room. Watching them together was like seeing two versions of the same person separated by a generation. My sister learned the art of invisibility, never causing trouble, never asking for much, accepting whatever scraps of attention came her way without complaint. She perfected the skill of being perfectly pleasant and perfectly forgettable. I was the one who couldn't figure out the formula. Too loud when silence was required, too quiet when participation was expected. Too sensitive about criticism, too stubborn about changing. Too much of whatever he didn't want me to be. The irony is that in those early years, before the disappointment calcified into something harder, I think he genuinely tried to connect with me. I remember him teaching me to change a tire when I was 12, his hands guiding mine as we worked the jack and loosened the bolts. "Every woman should know how to take care of herself," he said, and I felt the weight of his wisdom, the gift of his attention. He took me fishing on summer mornings when I was 10, both of us sitting in comfortable silence as the sun came up over the lake. We never caught much, but I treasured those hours of his undivided focus, the way he'd point out different birds or explain the best spots to cast a line. When I won the school science fair in 6th grade with a project on renewable energy, he drove me to the regional competition himself, bragging to other parents about my research on solar panels. For a brief, shining moment, I was the daughter he'd always wanted. But as I got older, those moments became rarer, replaced by a growing sense that I was failing some test I didn't understand. The criteria for his approval kept shifting, always just beyond my reach. "You used to be such a sweet little girl," he'd say when I'd argue about curfew or question his decisions. As if growing up was a betrayal, as if having opinions was a character flaw I'd developed out of spite. The tragedy of our relationship wasn't that he never loved me, it was that his love came with conditions I could never consistently meet. I spent my teenage years chasing the ghost of his early approval, trying to become the daughter who'd made him proud before I'd disappointed him by becoming myself. By the time I was 17, I'd stopped believing that things could go back to the way they were. The gap between us had widened into something that felt permanent, filled with years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. But I still hoped. Right up until that last fight, some part of me believed that family meant forever, that blood created bonds strong enough to survive even our worst moments. I was wrong about that, too. When he told me to pack my things and leave, it wasn't anger talking, it was relief. Relief at finally being able to cut ties with the daughter who'd never quite fit his vision of what our family should look like. The girl who'd once begged for his attention was about to learn what life looked like without it. The first month was the hardest. I crashed on friends' couches, slept in my car when those arrangements fell through, and learned that charity has limits even among people who care about you. Nobody wants to be responsible for someone else's family drama for long. After a few weeks of sympathy and spare bedrooms, even the most well-meaning friends start hinting that you should probably figure something else out. I found a studio apartment above a pizza place, the kind of place where the heat barely worked and you could hear everything your neighbors were doing through walls thin as paper. But it was mine in a way nowhere had ever been before, and I protected that independence like something precious. The loneliness was physical, a constant ache in my chest that made simple things like grocery shopping feel overwhelming. I'd find myself standing in the cereal aisle fighting back tears, not because I couldn't afford breakfast, but because there was nobody left who cared whether I ate it. I got a job waiting tables at a diner that served coffee bitter enough to wake the dead and pie that made up for it. The work was hard, the customers often cruel, but it paid enough to keep me fed and sheltered. More importantly, it gave me somewhere to go every day, a routine that didn't involve thinking about what I'd lost. The replay loop in my head was vicious. Every conversation we'd ever had got filtered through new understanding, every criticism reframed as evidence that he'd been looking for an excuse to get rid of me all along. Had I really been that difficult? That disappointing? That fundamentally unlovable? I'd catch myself rehearsing different versions of our last fight, imagining scenarios where I'd said the right thing, made the right choice, somehow avoided the words that led to exile. But every imaginary conversation ended the same way, with the recognition that our problems went deeper than any single argument could fix. My 18th birthday passed unmarked. No cards, no calls, no acknowledgement that I'd reached what was supposed to be an important milestone. I bought myself a cupcake from the grocery store bakery and ate it alone in my apartment, trying to convince myself this was freedom instead of abandonment. The hardest part wasn't the practical stuff, learning to budget, figuring out insurance, navigating the adult world without a safety net. It was the emotional arithmetic of trying to figure out my own worth without the familiar reference points of family approval or disapproval. Who was I when nobody was watching? What did I actually want when there was no one left to please or rebel against? The questions felt enormous and terrifying and absolutely necessary. I started making choices based purely on what felt right to me, not what would earn anyone else's approval. I cut my hair short because I liked how it looked, not because it was fashionable or practical. I painted my apartment walls bright yellow because it made me happy, not because it increased resale value or matched any design scheme. Small rebellions, maybe, but they felt revolutionary to someone who'd spent 18 years trying to be the right kind of daughter. The silence from my family was absolute. No check-in calls, no birthday cards, no invitations to holidays or celebrations. I'd been erased so completely it was like I'd never existed at all. I told myself this was what I wanted: freedom from their judgment, space to become whoever I was meant to be. But late at night in that studio apartment, listening to the pizza place's exhaust fan rattle against the building, I missed them with an intensity that surprised me. Not the criticism, or the conditional love, or the walking on eggshells tension that had defined our final years. I missed the good moments, the shared jokes, the sense of belonging somewhere even when that somewhere wasn't perfect. I missed having people who knew my history, who remembered the shy kid who'd hidden behind her mother's legs at parties, or the teenager who'd cried for 3 days when our dog died. I missed being part of something larger than myself, even if that something had ultimately rejected me. But grief, I was learning, doesn't kill you. It changes you, reshapes you into someone capable of carrying loss without being crushed by it. I was becoming stronger in ways I'd never needed to be before. The moment when everything shifted came about 6 months after I'd been thrown out. I was walking home from work, tired and probably feeling sorry for myself, when I passed a military recruiting station. The posters in the window showed young people in uniform, standing tall, looking like they belonged to something important. I stopped walking and studied those faces. They looked proud, purposeful, part of something bigger than their individual struggles. For the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness or anger or confusion. I felt possibility. The recruiter was patient with my questions, understanding when I explained that I didn't have family support, that I was completely on my own. She talked about education benefits, job training, the chance to serve something greater than myself. The military becomes your family, she said, and something in my chest loosened at those words. I didn't sign up that day or even that week. But I kept walking past that recruitment station, kept looking at those posters, kept imagining myself as one of those young people who'd found their place in the world. The decision, when it finally came, felt inevitable. I was going to stop waiting for my old family to take me back and start building a new life with people who'd judge me on my actions, not my history. I was going to prove that the girl they'd thrown away was worth something after all. The recruiter's name was Sergeant Martinez, and she had the kind of steady presence that made you want to sit up straighter and speak more clearly. When I finally walked into that office with serious questions instead of idle curiosity, she treated me like an adult making an adult decision. "Why the Army?" she asked, and I found myself telling her more than I'd intended. About being on my own, about needing structure and purpose, about wanting to be part of something that mattered. I didn't tell her about Dad, about the fight or the exile, or the way I was still hoping to prove something to people who'd stopped caring. That felt too personal, too raw for a conversation with someone whose job was to evaluate my potential. Military life isn't easy, she warned me. It's going to push you in ways civilian life never will. You'll be tested physically, mentally, emotionally. Not everyone makes it through. The challenge in her words didn't scare me, it energized me. I'd been drifting for months, working dead-end jobs and living day to day with no larger goal than survival. The idea of being pushed, tested, forced to discover what I was actually capable of, felt like salvation. I scored well on the aptitude tests, high enough to qualify for programs that would set me up for a real career instead of just military service. The possibilities spread out before me like a map of places I'd never imagined I could go. Basic training was scheduled to start in 3 months, which gave me time to get my affairs in order, a laughably simple process when your entire life fits in a studio apartment and your possessions can be packed in a few hours. I gave notice at the diner, sold what little furniture I'd accumulated, and prepared to disappear into a new identity as completely as I'd been erased from my old one. The night before I left for basic, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I drove past my childhood home, parking across the street like some kind of stalker, looking at the windows where my family was probably having dinner without me. The house looked smaller than I remembered, more ordinary. The mythical power it had held over me for 18 years seemed diminished now that I was looking at it from the outside, no longer seeking entry. I didn't see anyone, didn't even know if they were home. But sitting there in my beat-up Honda, I felt something shift inside me. This place, these people, they were my past, not my future. Whatever happened next would be something I'd build for myself. I drove away without looking back. Basic training nearly killed me. Not literally, though there were days when the physical demands made death seem like a reasonable alternative to another mile of running with a full pack, but it stripped away every assumption I'd ever had about my own limitations. The drill sergeants specialized in finding your weakest points and hammering them until they became strengths or you broke completely. They yelled at us, pushed us, demanded excellence in everything from making beds to field exercises to academic performance. For someone who'd grown up walking on eggshells around one man's temper, being yelled at by professionals was almost liberating. This wasn't personal anger or disappointment. This was training, designed to build us into something stronger than we'd been when we arrived. I discovered I was faster than I thought, smarter than I'd been given credit for, tougher than anyone, including myself, had believed possible. The girl who'd been too sensitive, too stubborn, too much trouble for her own family turned out to be exactly what the army needed. My squad became the family I'd been promised, bonded by shared misery and mutual dependence. We covered for each other's weaknesses, celebrated each other's victories, and learned that trust wasn't something you could demand, it was something you earned through consistent action. When I graduated basic training, there was no one in the audience cheering for me. While other families took pictures and celebrated their soldiers, I stood alone, proud but solitary. It hurt, that absence, but it also clarified something important. This achievement was entirely mine. No one had helped me get here. No one had supported me through the hardest parts. No one had believed in me when I doubted myself. Whatever I accomplished from this point forward would be built on a foundation of my own strength and determination. I chose military police as my specialty, drawn to the idea of maintaining order, of being someone people could count on when things went wrong. The training was demanding, the standards high, but I thrived in an environment where competence mattered more than personality or family connections. My first assignment was overseas, at a base in Germany where American soldiers supported NATO operations. The work was challenging, sometimes dangerous, always important. I was part of something larger than myself in a way I'd never experienced before. I found I had a talent for leadership, for earning respect from people who had no reason to give it except for what I proved in action. The soldiers under my command didn't care about my family history or the circumstances that had led me to the military. They cared about whether I could do the job, whether I had their backs, whether I deserved the rank I wore. Letters from home never came because there was no home to receive them from. While other soldiers complained about care packages from mothers and girlfriend drama, I focused entirely on my career, on becoming the best soldier and leader I could be. The promotions came steadily. Corporal, then sergeant, then staff sergeant as I proved myself in increasingly responsible positions. Each new rank was earned through performance evaluations, peer reviews, and demonstrated competence under pressure. I learned to compartmentalize the hurt of family rejection, to channel that energy into professional achievement. Every medal, every commendation, every positive evaluation report felt like evidence that the people who dismissed me had been wrong. But success in the military wasn't just about proving a point to people who were no longer watching. It was about discovering capabilities I'd never had the chance to develop in civilian life, about finding purpose that went beyond personal validation. I was good at this work. I was good at maintaining discipline while caring for my soldiers' welfare, at making quick decisions under pressure, at earning trust through consistent competence. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The years passed in a blur of deployments, training exercises, and steady advancement through the ranks. I served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen other places where American military presence was needed to maintain stability or support humanitarian operations. Each deployment taught me something new about leadership, about courage, about the weight of responsibility for other people's lives. I made decisions that affected soldiers under my command, that contributed to missions with real consequences in the world. The woman who'd been too much trouble for her own family became someone other people looked to for guidance and protection. It was a transformation I could never have imagined during those early days of exile and uncertainty. By the time I'd been in the army for 10 years, I was a major with multiple combat deployments and a reputation for getting difficult jobs done. My personnel file was thick with commendations, efficiency reports that praised my leadership capabilities, and recommendations for further advancement. I'd found my calling in ways that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with discovering who I was meant to become when given the chance to grow. The kid who'd packed her belongings in garbage bags was gone, replaced by a professional soldier who commanded respect through competence and integrity. It was the kind of transformation that felt complete until the day I received an invitation that reopened old wounds I'd thought were fully healed. My brother was getting married, and apparently the family had decided it was time for me to be acknowledged again. The wedding invitation arrived at my base address, forwarded through military mail with my brother's careful handwriting on the envelope. Inside was elegant cardstock announcing his marriage to someone I'd never met, in a church I'd attended as a child, with a reception at the country club where I'd never been welcome. At the bottom, someone had written in pen, "We'd love to have you there if you can make it." No signature, no acknowledgement of the 15 years that had passed since we'd spoken. Just a casual invitation, as if I'd been away on an extended vacation instead of building an entire life without them. I stared at that invitation for a long time, trying to decide what it meant. Was this an olive branch? An attempt at reconciliation? Or just social obligation, the kind of gesture you make so you can tell yourself you tried? Part of me wanted to ignore it entirely. I'd learned to live without their approval, built a career and an identity that had nothing to do with family expectations. Why risk reopening wounds that had taken years to heal? But another part of me was curious. What had they thought during all these years of silence? Did they wonder how I'd turned out, whether I'd succeeded or failed in the life I'd built without their support? Had they ever regretted the way things ended? I was due for leave, and Germany wasn't that far from home. I could fly back, make an appearance, satisfy my curiosity about who we'd all become in the years since our family imploded. The decision to attend wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about closure, about seeing these people as they really were instead of carrying around the mythologized versions that had haunted me for so long. I requested leave, bought a plane ticket, and prepared to face the family that had erased me from their lives with the same casual efficiency they'd apparently decided to invite me back. I had no idea what I'd find when I got there. I only knew that I was going as Major Morgan, not as the 18-year-old girl they'd thrown away. Whatever happened next would happen on my terms, with my strength, guided by the confidence I'd earned through 15 years of proving myself to people who actually mattered. The uniform made all the difference. When I walked into that church, heads turned not because people recognized me, but because military dress blues command attention and respect in ways that civilian clothes never could. I'd agonized over what to wear, finally deciding that honesty was the best policy. This was who I'd become, this was the life I'd built, and if they couldn't handle seeing the results of their rejection, that was their problem, not mine. The church was exactly as I remembered, dark wood pews, stained glass windows that threw colored light across the altar, the smell of old hymnals and furniture polish that hadn't changed in 30 years. But I was different, and that familiar space felt smaller, less intimidating than it had when I was a child fidgeting through Sunday sermons. I took a seat near the back, not wanting to create a scene, but unable to hide entirely. The uniform made anonymity impossible, and I could feel curious glances from other guests trying to place the military officer who'd appeared among the civilian wedding party. My mother saw me first. I watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been relief or regret, I couldn't tell which. She whispered something to my sister, who turned in her seat to look at me with the same wide eyes she'd had as a child. Neither of them approached me before the ceremony started, which was fine. I hadn't come here for tearful reunions or family reconciliation. I'd come to witness this moment and perhaps understand who we'd all become in the years since our fracture. My brother looked happy at the altar, more confident than I remembered him being as a teenager. His bride was beautiful in the way all brides are beautiful, glowing with the certainty that this day would be perfect because it had to be. The The ceremony proceeded with traditional vows and predictable readings about love and commitment and building a life together. I listened to the familiar words and tried not to think about the irony of celebrating family bonds in front of someone who'd been expelled from this particular family for the crime of wanting different things. When they kissed and turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, my brother's eyes found mine in the crowd. For a moment, his smile faltered, and I saw surprise and something else. Guilt, maybe, or embarrassment. Then someone started applauding and the moment passed. The receiving line was awkward. I hung back, letting other guests congratulate the happy couple first, trying to decide whether to approach them at all. But there's only so long you can hide in a small church, and eventually I found myself face to face with my brother and his new wife. "You came," he said, and his voice carried notes I couldn't decipher. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been genuine pleasure. "Congratulations," I replied, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "You look happy." His wife smiled with the kind of gracious warmth that suggested she'd been briefed on our family situation, but was determined to rise above it. "Thank you for being here," she said. "It means a lot to have family present." Family. The word sat strangely between us, loaded with history and absence and questions nobody wanted to ask in a receiving line. We chatted briefly about safe topics, the ceremony, the church, how beautiful everything looked. I complimented her dress, he asked vaguely about my work, and we all pretended this was a normal interaction between people who'd maintained regular contact over the years. Then I moved on, letting other guests have their turn, and made my way to the reception with the uncomfortable awareness that the hardest part of this day was still ahead of me. The country club reception was elegant in the way that money can buy: white linens, elaborate floral arrangements, a band that played the kind of music designed to offend no one and please everyone. I found my assigned seat at a table with extended family members who clearly had no idea who I was or why I'd been included. That's when I saw him. Dad, standing near the bar with a group of men his age, holding court in the way he'd always been able to do at social gatherings. He looked older, grayer, but still carried himself with the authority that had once seemed so intimidating. Our eyes met across the crowded reception hall, and the years collapsed between us. For a moment, I was 18 again, standing on the front porch with garbage bags full of clothes, and he was the man who'd decided I wasn't worth keeping. But then the moment passed, and I remembered who I'd become in the intervening years. I straightened my shoulders, adjusted my uniform jacket, and met his gaze with the steady confidence of someone who'd learned to stand her ground under much worse pressure than family disapproval. He looked away first. The confrontation came during dinner, when the speeches were scheduled to begin. I'd spent the meal making polite conversation with relatives who kept asking what I did for work, their eyes widening when I mentioned my rank and recent deployment history. "A major already," my elderly aunt said with genuine admiration. "That's quite an achievement for someone so young." It was nice to be seen as successful rather than problematic, to have my accomplishments recognized without the filter of family disappointment that had colored every interaction in my youth. But Dad had been watching me throughout the evening, and as the speeches began, he made his move. The best man had just finished his toast when Dad stood up, glass in hand, commanding attention the way he'd always been able to do. "Before we continue," he said, his voice carrying across the reception hall, "I want to acknowledge someone special who's joined us tonight." My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected public recognition, hadn't wanted to be put on display in front of people who didn't know our history. "My daughter has come a long way to be here," he continued, and there was something in his tone that made me uneasy. In fact, if it wasn't for Charity, she probably wouldn't even be here at all. The words hit like a physical blow. Charity. He'd managed to turn my military service, my independence, my entire adult life into something pathetic and dependent. In one sentence, he'd reduced me back to the rejected teenager who'd needed help just to survive. The room went quiet, confused murmurs rippling through the crowd as people tried to understand what they'd just heard. My brother's face went pale, his new wife looked stricken, and I felt 15 years of carefully built confidence crumble under the weight of public humiliation. But then something unexpected happened. My sister-in-law, This woman I'd met only hours earlier stood up and took the microphone from the DJ. Her voice was clear and strong when she spoke, cutting through the uncomfortable silence with the authority of someone who decided to take control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "I'd like you to please rise for Major General Morgan." The correction was small but devastating. Not Major Morgan, as I'd introduced myself, but Major General, a rank I hadn't mentioned, hadn't wanted to make a big deal about, but one that commanded instant respect from anyone who understood military hierarchy. Dad's face went white as the implications sank in. Major General wasn't just a respectable rank, it was the kind of position that required Senate confirmation, the kind of achievement that put you in rooms with the most senior military leaders in the country. The guests rose uncertainly, many of them clearly unsure what was happening, but willing to follow the bride's lead. I remained seated, overwhelmed by the gesture and the sudden shift in the room's energy. My sister-in-law wasn't finished. "Major General Morgan has served our country with distinction for over 15 years, including multiple combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. She's one of the youngest women ever to achieve her rank, and we're honored to have her here tonight to celebrate this special day." The applause that followed was genuine, filled with the kind of respect Americans instinctively show for military service when it's properly recognized. People were looking at me with new eyes, seeing not the family reject Dad had painted me as but an accomplished officer who dedicated her life to serving something larger than herself. Dad remained standing, his glass still raised, but the power had shifted completely. He'd intended to diminish me in front of these people, to remind everyone that I was somehow lesser, dependent on others' goodwill for my presence at this family gathering. Instead, his new daughter-in-law had revealed the truth, that the daughter he'd thrown away had become more successful than anyone in this room, had earned respect and authority through her own efforts, had built a life of service and achievement that dwarfed whatever small-minded satisfaction he'd gotten from rejecting me 18 years earlier. I stood finally, nodding graciously to acknowledge the applause, but my eyes were on Dad. He was trapped in his own gesture, forced to maintain his toast position while everyone in the room understood exactly how badly he'd misjudged the situation. "Thank you," I said simply when the applause died down. "It's an honor to be here to celebrate my brother's marriage." I sat back down as conversations resumed around the room, but the dynamic had changed permanently. Dad's attempt to publicly diminish me had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own pettiness while highlighting exactly how wrong he'd been about my potential. My sister-in-law caught my eye from across the room and nodded slightly, a gesture of solidarity that said more than any lengthy conversation could have. She'd taken my side in a family conflict she barely understood, had used her position as the bride to protect me from her new father-in-law's cruelty. It was a kindness I hadn't expected and would never forget. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of congratulations from guests who wanted to hear about my military career, apologies from family members who'd had no idea about my achievements, and pointed silence from Dad, who spent the remainder of the evening avoiding eye contact with anyone who might want to discuss his earlier comments. My mother approached me as the evening was winding down, her face carrying years of regret and uncertainty. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. I should have said that a long time ago. It wasn't enough to heal 18 years of absence, but it was something. An acknowledgement that mistakes had been made, that I deserved better than I'd received. "Thank you," I replied, because forgiveness isn't always about the person asking for it. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying old hurt. But Dad never approached me, never acknowledged what had happened, never apologized for the years of silence or the public humiliation he'd attempted that evening. He remained across the room, smaller somehow, diminished by his own actions in ways that had nothing to do with me. I left the reception as I'd arrived alone, but no longer lonely. The family that had rejected me had revealed themselves to be exactly as small and limited as I'd eventually learned to see them. But I'd also discovered that family could be chosen, that kindness could come from unexpected sources, that the life I'd built without their approval was more substantial than anything they'd ever offered me. Driving away from that country club, still in my dress blues, I felt the final piece of childhood hurt dissolve. I'd spent years proving myself to people who weren't worthy of the effort, carrying their rejection like a wound that wouldn't heal. But wounds, properly treated, become scars. And scars are just evidence that you survived something that tried to break you. I'd survived their rejection, built a life of service and achievement that had nothing to do with their limited vision of who I should have been. Their approval had ceased to matter long before that wedding, but seeing Dad's reaction when confronted with the reality of what I'd accomplished had provided a clarity I hadn't known I needed. Some bridges burn for good reasons. Some families aren't worth the effort of reconciliation. Some rejections are gifts that push you toward a better version of yourself than you ever could have become while seeking approval from people who were never going to give it freely. I flew back to my base the next morning with the satisfied knowledge that I'd closed a chapter of my life that had stayed open too long. Whatever happened with my family in the future would happen on my terms, with my understanding of my own worth firmly in place. The girl who'd been thrown out at 18 had become a woman who couldn't be diminished by anyone's small-minded cruelty. And that transformation, painful as the journey had been, was worth more than any family approval I'd ever sought. 18 years after Dad threw me out, I'd proven that his rejection said everything about his limitations and nothing about my potential. Some victories are worth the wait, especially when they're built on a foundation of self-respect that no one else can shake. The military had given me more than career advancement and financial security. It had given me a family that chose me based on my character and capabilities, a purpose that extended beyond personal validation, and the unshakable knowledge that I belonged exactly where I'd ended up. Looking back, getting thrown out at 18 was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to discover strengths I never would have developed while seeking approval from people who were determined not to give it. Some doors close so that better ones can open. Some rejections are redirections toward a life you never would have chosen but desperately needed to live. I'd found my place in the world, and it had nothing to do with the people who'd decided I didn't fit in theirs. The months following my brother's wedding brought unexpected changes. My sister-in-law, Rebecca, reached out through email, a careful, thoughtful message that acknowledged the complexity of our family situation while expressing genuine interest in maintaining contact. "I hope you don't mind me writing," her first email began. "I've been thinking about what happened at the reception, and I wanted you to know that what your father said was completely inappropriate. I also wanted to thank you for handling it with such grace." Her messages came sporadically at first, updates about married life, mixed with questions about my work that showed genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. She was a teacher, it turned out, working with high school students who were considering military careers, and she often asked for advice about resources and programs that might help them. Through Rebecca, I learned small details about my family's life over the past 18 years. My mother had gone back to school, earning a nursing degree in her 50s. My sister had moved to Seattle, working for a tech company and apparently thriving in ways she'd never been able to at home. Even my brother had changed, Rebecca reported, becoming more thoughtful and questioning about family dynamics since their marriage. "He feels terrible about the wedding," she wrote in one email. "He said he never realized how much damage had been done until he saw your father's reaction to your success. He's been carrying guilt about not standing up for you when you were younger." The guilt wasn't necessary, I told her. We'd all been children navigating an impossible situation, trying to survive in a household where approval was scarce and criticism abundant. I didn't blame my siblings for protecting themselves the only way they knew how. But Rebecca's emails opened a window into a world I'd written off completely. Through her eyes, I began to see my family members as individuals rather than as part of the monolithic unit that had rejected me. They'd all been shaped by Dad's temperament and expectations, just as I had, but they'd found different ways to cope with the pressure. 6 months after the wedding, Rebecca called with news that surprised me. "Your father had a heart attack," she said without preamble. "He's stable now, but it was serious. Triple bypass surgery." The information hit me strangely. I felt concern, which surprised me, mixed with the complicated emotions that come when someone who hurt you faces their own mortality. Whatever anger I'd carried toward him over the years had largely faded, replaced by indifference and the satisfaction of a life well lived despite his lack of support. "How is everyone handling it?" I asked. Your mother's staying at the hospital around the clock. Your brother is flying in tomorrow. And Rebecca paused. He's been asking about you. The idea of Dad asking about me after 18 years of silence felt surreal. What could he possibly want to know? Whether I'd forgiven him. Whether I'd visit him in the hospital. Whether the daughter he'd thrown away would show up for his potential deathbed. I'm not sure what you want me to do with that information, I said honestly. Nothing, Rebecca replied quickly. I just thought you should know. Whatever you decide is entirely up to you. I didn't visit him in the hospital. I wasn't ready for that conversation, wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for it, and I saw no reason to complicate his recovery with the emotional weight of our unresolved history. Instead, I sent flowers through Rebecca, a generic arrangement with a card that simply said, wishing you a speedy recovery. It was more than he'd ever given me, and exactly as much as I was prepared to offer. Dad survived the surgery and the long recovery that followed. According to Rebecca's updates, the experience had changed him in ways that made my family cautiously optimistic. He was quieter, more reflective, apparently willing to acknowledge that some of his past decisions might have been mistakes. He talks about regret a lot, Rebecca reported during one of our phone calls. Not specifics, but general statements about things he wishes he'd handled differently. Regret is easy when you're facing mortality, I thought, but didn't say. The real test would be whether that introspection translated into actual change, or just remained comfortable self-reflection that didn't require any difficult conversations or genuine accountability. A year after his heart attack, Dad did something I never expected. He wrote me a letter. Rebecca forwarded it through military mail, and I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. His handwriting looked shakier than I remembered, but the words were clearly his. Morgan, the letter began, using my first name for the first time in nearly 2 decades. I know I have no right to contact you after all these years, and I won't blame you if you throw this letter away without reading it. But I needed to say some things, and I'm running out of time to say them. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on yellow legal pad paper. In it, he acknowledged that throwing me out had been wrong, that his anger and disappointment had blinded him to my potential, that he'd let his own limitations define what was possible for his children. I was raised by a man who believed that love was earned through obedience, he wrote. When you refused to be obedient in the way I expected, I thought that meant you didn't deserve love. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. He talked about watching my military career from a distance, reading articles about women in leadership positions and wondering if one of them might be me. He'd searched my name online occasionally, he admitted, finding mentions in military publications and feeling pride he had no right to claim. Rebecca showed me pictures from her phone after your brother's wedding, he continued. You looked strong, confident, like you'd found your place in the world. I'm glad you did, even though I had nothing to do with it. Maybe especially because I had nothing to do with it. The letter ended with an apology that felt both too little and surprisingly meaningful. I'm sorry I failed you as a father. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve a second chance. I just wanted you to know that you turned out exactly as you should have, despite me, not because of me. I'm proud of who you became, even if I gave up the right to say that a long time ago. I read the letter 3 times, then put it in my desk drawer and didn't think about it for a week. When I finally did think about it, what struck me wasn't the apology, but the recognition that we'd both become different people than we'd been 18 years earlier. The man who'd thrown me out had been rigid, angry, incapable of seeing past his own expectations. The man who'd written this letter sounded tired, reflective, aware of his own failures in ways that suggested genuine growth rather than just polite regret. I wrote back a shorter letter that acknowledged his apology without offering complete absolution. I told him about my current assignment, my plans for eventual retirement, the life I'd built that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. I wished him well and left the door open for further communication without promising anything specific. I'm glad you found peace with your choices, I wrote at the end. I found mine too. We exchanged a few more letters over the following months, careful conversations about safe topics that avoided the deeper wounds while establishing a basic civility neither of us had expected. It wasn't reconciliation, exactly, but it was something, an acknowledgement that people can change, that time can soften edges that once seemed impossibly sharp. When I was promoted to Lieutenant General 2 years later, Rebecca sent him a newspaper clipping about the ceremony. He wrote to congratulate me, a brief note that expressed pride without claiming any credit for my achievements. It felt appropriate, honest in a way our relationship had never been before. The family that had rejected me would never be the family I'd wanted as a child. Too much time had passed, too many words had been spoken, too many silences had stretched between us. But they could become something else. Distant relatives who respected what I'd accomplished, people I could interact with during major life events without the old wounds reopening every time we spoke. It wasn't the ending I'd dreamed of as an 18-year-old packing her belongings into garbage bags. But it was better than the perpetual anger and hurt I'd carried for so many years. Sometimes the best resolution isn't getting what you originally wanted. It's discovering that you no longer need it to feel complete. And that's how 18 years of silence ended, not with his apology, but with my own strength being recognized in front of everyone. Sometimes the best justice is simply living the life they swore you never could. Have you ever had to prove someone wrong who doubted you? Did standing your ground change the way others saw you, or the way you saw yourself? Share your story in the comments. I read every one. And if this resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true stories about setting boundaries, earning respect, and finding your own voice.